Episode 36, Part 13, Chapter 34. Chapter 34. With weapon defeated, Cloud and the others returned to the bridge of the Highwind to plan their next move. Outside the Highwind, a strong wind was beginning to blow from the south as the impending storm clouds drew ever closer. They would be over the city of Midgar within an hour at the most. Cloud looked out the window and folded his arms across his chest. He was thinking about Holy. What kind of magic was holy that it would bring an end to Meteor? His thoughts turned darker. Meteor was already so close. What if it was already too late for Holy? Then there was the added worry of what would happen to them. If Holy was unleashed. The swordsman shook those thoughts from his mind. Whatever Holy was, Eris had put all her faith into it, had given her life for it. Worrying about their lives was meaningless, not when the whole planet was at stake. Eris had understood that they had to honor that belief that Holy would do what was best for the planet. But for that to happen, they first had to defeat the one who was holding Holy's power in thrall. As long as he still existed, the planet would never be safe. Cloud turned from the window.
What happened to Sephiroth?
He asked aloud. He tapped his foot against the floor. The eyes of others were on him, waiting for him to make a decision. Eventually Cloud nodded his head, his mind made up.
Northern Cave. Let's go see what happened to it.
Sid barked an order at the pilot, who immediately turned the airship around and began to fly north as fast as it could go. Within minutes they passed over the shores of the eastern continent, following the Mako Shell's route to the northern crater. It was not long before they passed over the last of the mountain ranges and came to a slow stop about half a kilometer away. The energy barrier had gone. Shinra had succeeded. Cautiously the Highwind moved forward and hovered at the edge of the crater. Cloud and the others crowded around the window and peered out.
Sephiroth's energy barrier is gone,
Cloud observed. He looked down into the hole. At this time of day the light of the sun did not shine into the crater, making it appear incredibly dark inside. He could see nothing inside. Cloud turned from the window.
Sid, can the airship get inside?
Hey. Sid scowled and rubbed his nose, before patting the Highwind's pilot roughly on the shoulder.
He's my student, ain't he? Of course he can go anywhere.
At this the pilot beamed, practically glowing with pride, touched by this compliment from one of the most prestigious pilots on the planet. Cloud scratched the back of his head, feeling rather sheepish under the pilot's insulted gaze.
Right, he said hesitantly, sorry about that.
He glanced at Tifa. The young woman covered her mouth and giggled. Barrett watched all this with little interest. His thoughts were on Marlene. Was she safe? He had little doubt that Elmira would do her best to ensure that Marlene was unharmed by Shinra. But not even Elmira could protect the little girl from weapon. Even he had not been able to defeat that monster. Well, he probably could have if Shinra had not intervened. Shinra. The name still made him furious inside. He looked over at Kat, intending to ask more about Marlene. However, when he turned to the cat he saw that Kat had other things on his mind. He had his back to Barrett and the others and appeared to be drumming his fists angrily against the Mog's head. The Mog, in turn, hopped from foot to foot.
Yo, Kat. Now what?
Called Barrett irritably. This was not a good sign. For a moment Kat ignored him. Then the cat suddenly threw his arms into the air and shouted loudly. This drew everyone's attention on him, as they turned and stared at him in complete surprise.
Hold it!
The cat said. He sounded both angry and panicked by something. The cat lowered his arms and moved the Mog away from the others. He stopped it at the back of the bridge where his reception was clearest and placed one hand over his right ear.
Scarlet, Heidegger. What's going on?
In the conference room, Heidegger closed his mobile and stared at it in confusion. His large brows furrowed deeply, until both brows joined in the middle to become one large line of fur.
Strange, he said. I can't reach the president.
Reeve, however, had other things on his mind. He had just received some extremely worrying news from the soldiers guarding the reactors and was, as a result of this, extremely agitated.
Not the president. To Sister Ray. What is it, Reeve?
Scarlet asked with a cackle.
You're speaking strangely.
She leaned against the conference room desk. It was no wonder Scarlet was acting so calm. According to the report they had received, her plans to destroy the energy barrier at the northern crater had worked perfectly. Not only that, it had completely obliterated weapon as well. Everything had gone in their favor. Why should she worry about anything else?
None of that matters,
exclaimed Reeve. He shook his head.
The reactor's output is increasing all by itself.
That got Scarlett's attention. She pushed herself away from the desk and stormed over to Reeve, her eyes widened in fear.
Wait a minute.
She stammered.
That's not wise. It must cool for 3 hours or it won't work. Reeve, shut off the machine.
She jabbed her finger at him, as though the problem was his doing. Reeve brushed her hand aside.
We can't do that. It's inoperable,
he told her. He turned from her and pulled out his phone. He called up the number 2 reactor and requested an update on the status of the reactors from the soldiers stationed inside.
Someone has switched the machine over to mainframe operation,
was the report he received.
We can't operate it from here. What about the mainframe? Who?
Reeve demanded. Unfortunately, the soldier did not know. Reeve cursed and hung up. The mainframe was the cannon's auxiliary control station, situated at the very top of the sister ray. In the event that any of the additional stations around the 7 reactors failed to function, control of the cannon and the reactors could be diverted to the mainframe. It was also a last resort station, since the immense Mako levels surrounding the cannon when it fired would surely kill the operator. Who would want to take over control of the cannon, knowing this? Reeve crossed his arms and tapped his foot on the floor. After a moment's thought he turned to Heidegger.
Hey, call the mainframe,
he ordered. Heidegger pulled out his phone again. He was just beginning to dial when he stopped and lowered his phone again. His dark eyes rested on Reeve, and his brow furrowed into a single line again.
Hey, why are you giving orders?
He asked. As much as Reeve wanted to point out that they were both heads of departments, this was no time to argue with the irritating man on company positions.
I don't give a damn about the details,
he snapped, losing patience. He turned from them again and pulled out his phone to call the mainframe himself. Behind him, Scarlett and Heidegger shared a glance, wondering.
Just you wait, Sephiroth. I'll give you the Mako you want.
Hojo reached over the console and slowly turned one of the dials. He then watched in satisfaction as the valves in the number 3 reactor opened up, and the deep glow of Mako rose from inside. The glow was not as impressive as the first time the reactors had been opened up, but it would do for now. The number 2 reactor was already open and was currently drawing more Mako from beneath the city. The lights of the city flickered and dimmed. It would be a while, an hour or 2 at least, before all 7 reactors were flowing again, but Hojo was not worried about that. His plans were already in motion, and nothing could interfere with him. On the console the intercom crackled, and Reeve's panicked voice shouted through to him.
Hojo, stop. The cannon, no. Midgar itself is in danger.
At first Hojo did not respond. He sighed heavily and began the preparations for opening up the number 4 reactor. This reactor was almost completely drained of energy, but Hojo ignored the warning signs and bypassed the security system. He chuckled.
1 or 2 Midgars,
he said, speaking mostly to himself rather than to Reeve. The professor paused momentarily and then shrugged.
It's a small price to pay. Hojo. Hojo.
As casually as if he was turning a page, Hojo reached over and flicked the intercom switch off. He did not want any interference from the plebeian thinkers who did not fully appreciate the sheer brilliance of the forces that Sephiroth had put into motion. The sacrifice of the lives of Midgar was a paltry one to pay in comparison to what would be achieved if Sephiroth achieved his goal and brought an end to this miserable planet.
Show me. Sephiroth. It should be near.
Over by the number 4 reactor, a siren began to sound. The scientist quickly and calmly pressed some buttons, and the siren stopped as the reactor core became stable again. Even this high up, he could hear the cries of panic coming from the idiotic citizens below. All of them running around, screaming, and crying to some god that did not exist. How Hojo pitied their foolishness. They would see soon enough. The professor paused in his work and looked up at the sky, where the dark storm clouds were beginning to settle over Midgar. He chuckled again to himself.
Go beyond the powers of science. Before your presence, science is powerless. I hate it, but I'll concede to it. Just let me see it.
And Hojo laughed once more and continued with his task. When Cloud and the others heard this, they were mortified. Had Hojo completely lost his mind? Themselves and Shinra were doing everything they could to stop Sephiroth, and here was Hojo trying to help him. Cloud shook his head, unable to believe that Hojo would go that far for the sake of science. Barrett meanwhile, was glaring at Cat angrily, his fist shaking.
Yo!
He said, barely able to contain his rage.
Do something! You big cat!
Cat Shi and his Mog both sagged in unison. They turned slowly and the Mog waddled miserably over to Barrett. The cat looked up at Barrett sheepishly, before letting his head fall to his chest again. He shook it glumly.
We're sunk. Hojo's doing this on his own.
The cat suddenly paused as a thought struck him.
Hey.
If it had been possible for Cat Shi to pale in fright, he would have right then. He was frightened because he had just realized, in his panic and confusion, that he had allowed Barrett and Cloud and all the others to overhear the conversation with Hojo. And in doing so, he had inadvertently revealed his true identity. Only an idiot would not figure it out. The cat's whiskers quivered and then he sagged again.
I don't like this,
he complained, his heart sinking like the clouds over Midgar. Barrett crossed his arms across his chest and smiled smugly.
You're busted, Reeve.
Knowing that the secret behind his true identity was out, Cat Shi leaned far over the Mog, his ears low over his face. Cat Shi, otherwise known as Reeve Tusti, head of Shinra's Urban Development Department. Though it was Reeve who controlled the cat from behind the scenes, the advancement of Shinra's technology was so great that the cat pretty much operated by itself. Cat could move and speak independently, obeying orders and relaying all the information it received to Reeve back in Midgar. As the channel between Cat and Reeve was always open, it was easy for Cat to receive extra information, which he could then pass on to Cloud and the others. The two were intrinsically linked, functioning like one extended being. Reeve was Cat, and Cat was Reeve. It was this level of technology, designed by the same science department that had created Sephiroth, which made Shinra the most powerful company the planet had ever known. Barrett continued to smile at Cat, smug that the cat had given away his identity at last. Cloud walked up and put a hand on Barrett's arm, a subtle warning to keep quiet. Who Cat really wasn't important right now. Barrett frowned and turned away stubbornly, thinking about Marlene.
Can't you stop the Mako reactor?
Cloud asked, ignoring the big man.
We can stop it,
Cat replied, without looking up. Barrett turned back and pushed past Cloud.
You're from Shinra, ain't you?
He asked.
So why's it impossible? We came a long way to get here,
said Sid.
You better not double-cross us now.
Once again Cat sighed. He released the Mog's controls and sat down on its soft pink head. He poked his red boot with his hand.
I can't make you trust me,
he said.
You dumb fool,
shouted Sid angrily.
Don't you understand anything I'm saying?
The pilot smacked his fist into the side of the nearest console. The suddenness of his strike startled the poor pilot and even startled Cat, who looked up at him in surprise. The pilot continued, I don't give a damn about Shinra.
If you're a man. No, if you're a human being, you'll save the planet. Don't you even care? No way. If we shut down the reactor, all hell will break loose. Why?
Sid asked, puzzled.
Can't you just shut off the valve?
Cat turned to him.
Yeah, it's easy to shut off the reactor's pipe valves,
he conceded.
But the reactor made a path for the energy to escape from below.
He turned from him to include everyone.
Once you open that, it's impossible to close it until everything blasts out. And we can't try to stop the energy gushing out.
Everybody took a moment to assimilate this new information. The scene came to them all too clearly. There was Midgar, a city at the center of a vast wasteland. Thousands of people lived in the city. At the edge of each sector were the 7 reactors, delving deep into the ground and sucking up the life stream that flowed there. Numerous pipes that regulated the flow of Mako to the reactors ran like a maze beneath the city, ensuring that each reactor was supplied with a constant, even supply of Mako. Once inside the reactors, the life stream was put under immense pressure, condensing it until it reached a state where it could be drawn out and converted into a usable form of energy. The valves that Sid had mentioned regulated the amount of energy that was sucked up, so that the reactors did not become swamped with compressed energy. The life stream, when compressed, was often unstable and required constant monitoring. Ordinarily the valves would automatically shut off once the pressure levels reached a certain point and preventing such an imbalance. But now Hojo was at the mainframe, bypassing the reactor's inbuilt security and forcing the valves open. More Mako would be drawn from the planet and gather in the reactors. The pressure would build to dangerous levels, the cores would become unstable, and the pressurized energy that had gathered would be forced to find an escape route. If Hojo closed the valves again, then the only path the Mako could take would be down into the pipes that ran beneath the city. The Mako would enter the pipes, and the pressure would, eventually, cause them to blow.
An explosion!
Exclaimed Barrett.
This blast'll be way bigger than when the number 1 reactor blew up,
said Kat. Barrett shook his head.
Damn.
The people of Midgar were standing on a ticking time bomb. Now they understood why Kat was so alarmed. The pressure in the reactors was growing with every second that passed. Unless Hojo was stopped, that pressure would continue to grow, until finally the pipes could take no more and blow, causing a catastrophic explosion that would engulf the entire city and the people in it. Cloud frowned. Damn that Hojo. All through the conversation Vincent remained silent, with his back to the others. Hearing Hojo's voice had brought back yet more painful memories. An almost uncontrollable anger burned inside him. If he had not spent 30 years sleeping away the guilt and shame, that anger would probably have overwhelmed him. Lucretia. Hojo. Vincent clenched his fingers tight around his arm, and the claws of his gauntlet dug into his bicep, bringing back his control.
Forget about that.
The sound of Katshi's voice broke through Vincent's thoughts, and the gunman turned his attention back to his friends. He turned and walked up to rejoin the group. Katshi was standing on the Mog's head.
The cannon!
He was shouting.
We've got to get to Midgar. That's the first thing.
Cloud looked over at Vincent. The gunman leaned against the edge of the stairs. He caught Cloud looking at him and gazed back at the swordsman. His expression was clear and unreadable, but the fierceness of his eyes revealed the anger that was burning there. Looking into Vincent's dark red eyes, Cloud recalled the moment when Vincent agreed to leave his long slumber and join them on their journey.
If I go with you, will I meet Hojo? Dunno. But we're after him and Sephiroth. So, I guess sooner or later. Lucretia? All right, I've decided to go with you. What? You're coming with us? Being a former Turks, I may be of help to you.
It seemed like so long ago to Cloud, but Vincent had been waiting even longer. All those years, he said, he had spent sleeping, dreaming of a shame he could not shake. Now, at last, Vincent was going to have the chance to confront the man who had played a part in that shame. Cloud turned from him and faced the others.
We must stop Hojo. First.
Back at Shinra headquarters, Reeve finished analyzing the data received from Kat and turned to Heidegger and Scarlet.
Looks like Cloud and the others are on their way,
he informed them.
Stay out of the way.
Heidegger looked at Reeve closely, and then burst into a sudden fit of laughter.
Don't be so ludicrous.
He guffawed.
I don't recall you giving me any orders. The peace preservation will give their best effort to make the enemy retreat.
The man then paused and clenched his fist, teeth grating in anger.
Because of them, That's a private matter,
said Reeve calmly. Heidegger unclenched his fist and looked up at Reeve, his brows furrowing once again. He had never liked Reeve, and disliked him even more now that Reeve was trying to give him orders. He had also harbored secret suspicions about Reeve's wavering loyalty to the company. Suspicions him and Scarlet both had raised with the president, but had gone unheard. As long as Reeve continued to provide information on the doings of Cloud and his little band of rebels, Rufus had said, Reeve continued to have some use. Now, though, that had changed.
The president is dead.
Heidegger protested loudly.
Now I'm doing things my way.
He and Scarlet both laughed. When she was done laughing, Scarlet turned to Heidegger.
Heidegger. Now I'm going to use the new weapon.
Scarlet clicked her fingers, and the two of the three soldiers guarding the door ran over to them. They stopped on either side of Reeve and drew their guns, pointing the barrels at his head warningly. Reeve stared at them in surprise, before turning his eyes on Heidegger and Scarlet. Heidegger was beaming, while a cold, twisted smile touched Scarlet's lips. Reeve could not believe it. Had they planned this all along? Without bothering to explain, Scarlet and Heidegger laughed again and headed for the door. The third soldier opened it as they approached and they exited the room, leaving Reeve under the guard of the soldiers.
Hey! Wait!
Reeve tried to call after them, but they didn't listen. When they had left, the third soldier slammed the door shut and stood in front of it. Reeve shook his head and looked up at the ceiling.
Cloud, everybody!
He said in dismay.
Sorry. But... You'll come, won't you?
Reeve's words rang loud and clear in the hearts of everybody on the bridge. Cloud unfolded his arms and walked over to Cat, who was looking at him hopefully.
I know,
Cloud said. Around him, the others nodded. Even Barrett, his anger forgotten in Cat/Reeve's heartfelt plea for their aid in Midgar. Sid turned to the pilot, who was waiting patiently for his orders.
Hey!
Said Sid.
I'm leaving the ship in your hands.
The pilot nodded and turned to the wheel.
I'm heading for Midgar,
he said. Cat looked around at the others standing around him, his hope rising. He had originally thought of Cloud and his friends as nothing more than a group of callous terrorists aiming for nothing more than causing Shinra trouble, and not caring one jot about the lives of innocents who fell in their wake. The destruction of the number 1 reactor had helped form that impression. But Cat was glad, deep down, that he had gotten this chance to travel with them. He believed that they, over anyone else, would have a chance to save Midgar from obliteration. If they could only get there in time. End of Part 13. Next part, Part 14, Gene Warfare. End of chapter. Episode 37, Part 14, Chapter 35. Part 14, Gene Warfare. Chapter 35. The high wind came to a stop.
We've reached Midgar,
the pilot announced. Cloud turned to the window. Midgar was dead ahead. Once upon a time Midgar was a sight to behold, but now it was nothing more than a shadow of the splendor it once had. The Shinra company was on the verge of collapse. Shinra headquarters had been heavily damaged, and smoke was still pouring from the upper levels. Cloud tried to see through the billowing smoke, but he could see nothing. The storm clouds he had seen coming in from the south earlier had almost fully settled over the city. They covered Midgar in shadow, making it appear dark and eerie. The clouds spanned the horizon as far as the eye could see. The wind was picking up, they could hear its howl as it blustered past the airship. The only good thing about the storm was that it blocked the sight of meteor in the sky. Yet even the thickest clouds could not block it out completely, for its burning light tinged the clouds a dark, deep red. Tifa joined Cloud by the window and looked out at Sector 7. It pained her to look upon her old home, and to think of all the thousands of people who had lost their lives because they had shared a sector with Avalanche. What pained her more was that it appeared Shinra had done nothing to clean up the damage. They had left it as it was, a cold example to anyone else who thought of going against Shinra. Much of the city was in darkness. 4 of the 7 reactors were now lit and draining what was left of the Mako from the city. Even from the sky they could hear the sirens howling, and the red lights that flashed around the reactors showed just how close they were to going into meltdown. The last 3 reactors, number 5 through 7, were still dark. They had very little time to reach the cannon and stop Hojo.
Even if we get there,
they heard Barrett say from behind them,
Midgar's under martial law. There'll be no way could slip into the slums.
CIT had informed them of this new update on the journey back. Heidegger and Scarlet, mad with power and refusing to accept that the Shinra company was all but done, had taken over the company and placed the entire city under martial law. Every sector had been sealed off, and every city exit had been closed and put under heavy guard. The soldiers guarding the exits and the Shinra building were given orders to shoot anyone who tried to escape or enter the Shinra building. Their intent was clear, they wanted the citizens kept under lock and key so they could cause no trouble. Anyone who didn't obey these laws, well, they were only citizens. And of course, martial law meant that nobody could get into the city either.
Looks like all transportation from the slums is cut off,
Tifa observed, as she realized that all the trains in the city had been stopped. It was as though the city had come to a complete standstill. Sid, however, remained optimistic.
Hey,
he said cheerfully, grinning widely,
what do you think we have high wind for? Where are we?
Hey? Asked Barrett, confused.
Where are we?
He scratched his head. Was this a trick question? They were in the sky, obviously, on board the High Wind. Reading Barrett's thoughts, Sid nodded his head. His grin became wider.
If land's no good,
he said. He gave Barrett a thumbs up.
We'll go by air.
Barrett stared at the pilot and his thumbs up in bewilderment. Was Sid serious? Was he suggesting that they should enter Midgar? By air. Barrett turned to Cloud to protest, but to his horror he saw that Cloud was smiling.
Okay then,
Cloud said, cutting Barrett off.
We'll parachute into Midgar.
Now Barrett stared at Cloud, thinking that the swordsman was just as mad as Sid. He tried to protest, but stopped when Tifa touched his arm. She smiled up at him. Barrett sighed heavily. If even Tifa was all for jumping into Midgar, then there was no point in arguing. And as he had pointed out, there was no other way into Midgar. He followed Cloud as the swordsman then led the way across the bridge, heading towards the outer deck. The rest of the group fell into line behind them, and the crewmen turned and saluted them as they passed. Word spread quickly throughout the High Wind. All of the airship's crews stopped in their work and gathered to watch as the group marched past. The looks of awe and pride touched the faces of every crew member as they saluted this band of heroes. Sid flushed in embarrassment and rubbed his nose, while Yuffie raised her head high and marched solidly across the floor, her pride winning over her motion sickness. The crewmen stood on either side of the steps leading to the outer deck, holding 8 parachute packs. They helped the companions get suited up for their jump. It was a difficult task to suit up Red 13, whose canine body was not properly built for backpacks. It was an even harder one getting the chute on Katshi's Mog, for the cat refused to leave it behind. Barrett shuffled about while the crewman adjusted the pack's straps for his larger frame. Eventually, they were all suited up, and the 2 crewmen saluted. Sid saluted back, and they headed up to the outer deck. The first thing that hit them as they stepped out was the wind. It was growing in strength, and almost wrenched the door from Cloud's hand as he opened it. In the distance, there was a roll of thunder. When they were all on the deck, Cloud shut the door and walked to the edge of the deck. He placed one boot against the rail and leaned over to survey the city. The High Wind was hovering high above Midgar. The smoke that had been pouring from the damaged Shinra building had now eased and was being blown northward by the wind, giving them a clear view. Cloud figured that their best bet was to parachute into one of the upper sectors close to the Shinra building and then find a way to infiltrate from there. He expected Kat already had a plan in mind for getting them inside, but they could probably help by landing as close to the center of the city as possible. Cloud just hoped that the soldiers patrolling the city grounds would be too busy sorting out the panicked citizens to pay any attention to attacks coming in from the sky. They should be able to sneak in unnoticed. He hoped. He took a breath.
Here we go,
he said, and then threw himself over the edge of the deck. Not wanting to be outdone, Sid ran forward and jumped onto the rails. He pulled his goggles over his eyes and then jumped over the edge. Tifa came after him, along with Barrett and all the others. They hurled themselves as far from the airship as they could before the wind caught them and they plummeted towards the ground. The wind rushed past their faces as they fell. It drowned out all other sounds and their eyes watered with the rush. Those that could kept their arms to their sides to increase their speed as they hurtled towards the city. Red 13 pawed at the air almost like he was running, his tail whipping behind him. Katshi clung to his Mog for dear life as it fell towards the ground, only now realizing that it had been a bad idea for only the Mog to be wearing a parachute. Sid cried out in exhilaration. For the pilot, who lived for the sky, this was almost as thrilling as going into space. The wind whipped across his skin and through his hair. He was not the only one to find the experience thrilling. Through the rushing wind he could hear Tifa also cry out in delight. Cloud was the first to open his parachute. As they fell past the cannon and the smoking Shinra building, Cloud yanked the release cord and opened the chute. The chute came out and caught the air. There was a sharp, breath-stealing tug as Cloud was pulled upright. Quickly the swordsman reached up, grabbed hold of the cords that were attached to the chute. His descent slowed, and his breath returned. He looked around. Following his lead, the others had also opened their parachutes and were beginning to float down towards the city. Sector 6 was coming in fast below them. Cloud tugged on the chute's cords and maneuvered himself over the sector, aiming for the inner edge about a quarter of a mile from the center. A particularly strong gust of wind blew as they neared the ground. The others were all right, but it caught Cloud by surprise and blew him firmly off course. The swordsman looked up in alarm as he realized that he was now heading towards Sector 7. Hurriedly the swordsman tugged on the cords and pulled the parachute firmly back away from the ruined sector. He saw the others disappear behind a building. It was too late to do anything about it now, and with the ground rushing in fast, all Cloud could do now was brace himself for the landing. Cloud hit the ground. Immediately he dropped and rolled over to spread area of impact. Still, it hurt, and a few moments his mind reeled with the sudden sense of being back on the ground. He recovered his senses after a few seconds and quickly rolled onto his front. He grabbed the chute's cords and began to pull the chute towards him. Once within reach he pressed down on the chute, deflating it before it had a chance to pick him up again. It deflated easily, and once Cloud was sure he would not be carried off again, he unclipped the backpack and climbed to his feet. He brushed himself off, and then looked around at his surroundings. The swordsman was standing in the middle of an abandoned street. The buildings were all dark inside, and many had doors that had been left open, presumably the occupants left in a hurry. There was no sign of the others. In fact, Cloud realized as he looked around, there were no signs of life of any kind, no soldiers, no citizens, not even a cat. However, over the roar of the wind, he could hear the angry shouts and cries of citizens some distance away. And also, somewhere nearby, gunshots could be heard. The soldiers had resorted to using force to maintain order. Cloud started to walk forward to search for his friends. He stopped suddenly as he heard a loud, repetitive thumping noise approaching him from the side. Cloud spun around and reached for his sword, but froze when he saw that it was just Cat She. The cat had seen Cloud land and had come looking for him. Cloud sighed and relaxed his grip. The others must have landed somewhere nearby. Seeing Cloud unharmed, Cat did not waste time with questions.
Heidegger is going after you all, he warned. That's why it's dangerous out there.
The cat looked around warily, before he turned and hopped away a few steps. He looked back at Cloud.
Let's go underground.
The cat hopped away again, and Cloud ran close behind him. Cat led him around the corner and into a dark, deserted alley. The others were gathered here, waiting impatiently. They had all landed safely, discarding their unneeded parachutes in a nearby crate. Yuffie had apparently been sick after landing, for her face was paler than normal. Cat hopped right past her and stopped next to a large sewer hatch at the end of the alley.
This is where we go in, he told them.
The cat tapped the Mog's head, and the Mog obediently leaned over the hatch. It took hold of the handle with its large pink fists and began to heave. The hatch grated loudly and everyone looked around cagily, fearful that someone might hear. But no one with an ounce of sense was in this part of the sector. They were all either in their homes or at the exits, trying to escape the city. Eventually the hatch cover came loose, and the Mog chucked it to one side out of the way. It landed with a loud clatter that echoed down the alley. Beneath the hatch was a ladder leading beneath the plate. Cat turned to Cloud.
Please. Hurry and come to the Mako cannon.
He begged. Cloud nodded in reply. The cat smiled gratefully, then turned and jumped down through the hole. For a moment Cloud feared the Mog's large, round body would get stuck, as hilarious as that would have been, but it fit through rather easily, and both Cat and Mog disappeared down the hole. Cloud climbed down the ladder after him, followed by the others. The ladder took them down into the sewers that ran directly beneath the plate. These sewers ran beneath every sector and formed a vast maze of interrelating tunnels that were almost impossible to navigate. Only someone like Reeve, who was in charge of urban development in Midgar, would know where to go. And so it was Cat who led the way, guiding the companions through the underground network. No map was needed, the cat knew these tunnels like the back of his paw. And unlike before when he would have accidentally given them the wrong directions and tried to hinder their progress, he now showed them every shortcut, every hidden path, and kept back nothing. Time was of the essence now, there was no time for paltry shenanigans. They made good progress, thanks to Cat's help. Within about 10 or 15 minutes they had traversed the quarter of a mile distance between the landing site and the center of Midgar. Their progress was slowed only by the usual riffraff of monsters that wandered the sewers. However, at their current level of fighting, these monsters were nothing but small fry and were easily brushed aside. They wasted no time dispatching them and then hurried on. After 5 more minutes of wandering, they found themselves at the foot of a long set of steps. Cat plodded right along, hopping up the steps. At the top there was a large air vent, and it was by this that Cat finally stopped. The cat turned, waiting for Cloud and the others to catch up.
In here,
he said to them.
This vent leads directly to the rail tracks outside of Sector 6. If we follow those, they will take us right to the cannon. Hurry. We haven't much time left. 5 of the reactors are now running again. Hurry. Hurry.
The cat hopped from foot to foot, but Cloud quickly noticed that Cat was making no move to enter the tunnel and was instead looking at him expectantly. As if to make his point even more clear, the cat waved at the vent entrance. Deciding not to waste time arguing, Cloud sighed and clambered into the air vent. He could see why Cat was reluctant to enter. Though the vent appeared to be quite large from the outside, once inside it became quite tight and cramped. After a few steps Cloud was forced to bend over, and from there onto his hands and knees, moving at a slow crawl. Behind him he heard a thud and a groan as Barrett climbed in. If it was cramped for Cloud, then it was worse for Barrett.
Damn, man. How cramped is this damn vent? Why don't you ask it?
Cloud heard Tifa say behind Barrett. The swordsman rolled his eyes. He had heard this argument before. Still, it was a relief to hear, for it reminded Cloud that once again that even after everything they had been through on this journey, some people remained the same. The vent curved sharply to the right. They followed it round, and Barrett grunted and cursed as he squeezed his large frame around the corner. The exit was just ahead. When Cloud reached, he had a quick look to make sure no one was around before he climbed out and jumped down onto the tracks. As Cat had said, the vent had led them straight onto the underground rail tracks. For a worrying moment Cloud feared that a train might come along and crush them, until he remembered that they had seen no trains running when they were on the high wind. Still, he did not want to let down his guard. Once everyone had climbed out of the vent, Cat retook the lead and began to hop down the tracks.
Oh no! They're here!
The group came to a stop. They recognized that voice. Turning, they looked back down the tracks. As they expected, Elena was running towards them. Cloud sighed heavily. Of all the times to run into the Turks, it had to be now. Elena came to a stop near them. Though she was out of breath and there was soot smeared over her face and hair, she forced herself to stand upright, refusing to show any weakness. She looked round at the group.
What are we going to do?
She asked loudly.
I think it's okay for you to ignore your orders now.
Cloud tilted his head. What was she talking about? What orders?
Elena, don't act so weak.
Cloud sighed again. He recognized that voice, too. Reno and Rude emerged from behind a pillar and walked up to stand beside Elena. They did not seem at all surprised to see Cloud and his friends here. And, frankly, Cloud was not at all surprised to see them, either. He had guessed that sooner or later the Turks would come after them. Yet there was no time. Rude adjusted his shades.
We're Turks, Elena,
he was saying to her. Elena sagged.
Yes, sir. You're right. Come on,
said Rude.
We've got work to do.
He raised his fists, ready for battle. Reno reached behind him and unhooked his electric rod from his belt.
I'm not really up for it,
he said with a sigh,
but...
He lifted the rod onto his shoulder, also ready. Elena turned back to the rebels. The confidence was back in her eyes as she stood proudly before them.
Our orders were to seek you out and...
She paused for dramatic effect.
Kill. Our company may be in turmoil, but an order's an order. That's the will and spirit of the Turks. Believe it.
Cloud reached for his sword. Then he stopped and looked at the Turks. Though Elena was all up for a final showdown between the Turks and the rebels, that enthusiasm did not seem to be shared with her two comrades. Reno's grip on his electric rod was slack, and his eyes kept shifting from place to place, as though he was torn by some decision. Rude's fists were loosely clenched, and his stance did not show that same willingness. Orders were orders, Elena had said. Cloud started to wonder.
What are you doing?
Elena demanded, growing impatient and seemingly unaware of the reluctance of her comrades. She stepped forward.
Let's go.
Cloud took a quick glance behind him. It seemed the others too, had picked up on Reno and Rude's reluctance to enter a battle with them. Tifa clasped her hands behind her back, a show of refusing to arm herself. Vincent folded his arms across his chest, also refusing to draw a weapon. Even Barrett, to Cloud's surprise, seemed just as reluctant and would not look at them. It was strange. Although the Turks were far from being their friends, they had been through a lot together. Every time they had met, they had ended up fighting. But did it always have to be that way? The Turks were just like every other employee of Shinra, just following orders. It never even occurred to Cloud that maybe they did not want to follow them. Looking at them now, he wondered. Orders were orders. But did they have to be? The more Cloud thought about it, the more he realized that he, too, did not want to fight them. There had been enough battles already, enough people sacrificed for a needless cause. If there should be more fighting, it should be against those that needed to be stopped. The Turks were not them. Cloud released his sword and shook his head.
No, let's not go.
His answer shocked Elena. She jumped about half a foot into the air.
You showing pity?
She cried. Her fists clenched angrily.
Don't take the Turks for fools.
She started to walk forward.
Wait, Elena.
Elena stopped and turned to Reno, more surprise in her eyes.
Reno.
She protested.
You're not violating the order. Are you?
Reno looked over at Cloud. The swordsman gazed steadfastly back at him. It seemed that Cloud understood. There was no need to fight, not now. Tseng had even said as much, when he gave them their orders. The Turk leader had always been reluctant to face off against Cloud and his friends, but Reno had never understood why. Now he did understand. Tseng had seen, long ago, that this day would come. A smile touched Reno's lips, and he lowered his weapon.
Shinra's finished, he said. It's come down to this.
Rude nodded his head, agreeing with his partner. Elena looked from one to the other. Unable to believe what she was hearing, she shook her head.
Rude,
she said almost pleadingly, looking at him. Rude did not respond. He simply lowered his fists and turned away from her, unable to meet her gaze. Elena stared helplessly at his back. Her fists tightened. And then relaxed. The anger left her face. She hung her head low and stared at the floor. Reno looked at her sad face. She was not sad because they were not going to fight. She was sad because she had finally realized that this was the end of Turks, the team she had worked so hard to enter. Everything she did was to gain the acceptance of her comrades, Reno, Rude, and Tseng. Being a member of the Turks was a source of pride for her, and now the source of that pride was crumbling.
Elena, you were a great Turk.
The young woman did not raise her head. She continued to stare at the floor. Was all she could say. Reno sighed and shook his head. She would come to understand, in time. He hooked his weapon onto his belt and turned back to Cloud and the others, who were watching the exchange in silence.
Farewell,
he told them.
If we can both survive. If we can save our lives.
He did not finish. Instead, he just flashed the group a confident grin before turning and walking back down the tracks away from them. As Reno walked away, Elena raised her head. She seemed to have come to a decision. The defiant look returned to her face and she clenched her fists, turning to face Cloud. She held his gaze firmly, and her brow creased.
Remember the spirit of the Turks,
she said fiercely. Then the anger left her face and she smiled, briefly, before turning and running back along the tracks after Reno. Now only Rude was left. The Turk's expression, as it always did, remained unchanged.
Our mission's finished,
was all that he said, before he too, turned and walked away. Cloud watched as the three Turks walked away. Tifa shouted after them, telling them that they had better survive, and she would not forgive them if they died. Without turning, Reno raised his hand. So the Turks abandoned their orders and left. Yet Cloud had the feeling that it would not be the last time he ever saw the Turks. End of chapter. Episode 38, Part 14, Chapter 36. Chapter 36. Once the Turks had gone, Katshiri took the lead and the group continued on their way. With no trains running, the underground railroads were deathly quiet. Midgar had never been this quiet before. Even underground, or in the slums, you could always hear the bustle of city life above. Now there was no hum of trains as they sped along the tracks, for the trains had halted. There was no hustle and bustle on the streets above, because the people had all fled. It reminded Cloud and Tifa of the train graveyard in the Sector 7 slums. The feeling was the same. How cold and eerie the used train dumping grounds had felt, so utterly silent and devoid of life. That was how the whole city felt now. The life had gone. They each thought about this as they moved quickly along the tracks, trying to keep up with Kat, who was bounding away as fast as the Mog could go. They could not afford to slow down, since time was of the essence. The group were reminded of how little time remained when the ground suddenly began to shake. They stopped and held on to each other as the ground trembled and the tracks rattled and clattered loudly. Dust fell from the ceiling in a thick, dusty cloud. An eerie screech echoed down the tracks. It sounded as though something was being forcibly dragged up from deep beneath the city. They knew what that scream was without being told. It was the cry of the planet, screaming in pain as the next reactor opened its valves and began to suck up more of the life stream from beneath the surface. It was so cold and chilling, it made the hairs on the backs of their necks stand on end. The scream continued for about 10 seconds before finally stopping, and the ground settled again.
"That's the number 6 reactor activated,"
Cat told them. Everyone turned to him.
"Only 2 reactors are left. We don't have much time. Hurry."
Even as Cat spoke, the ground started to hum, falling into a steady rhythm. There were no more screams from the planet, but they could guess that it was still in pain. Though it was comforting for something to break the ghostly silence, it was also a prompt for them to stop wasting time and hurry on. They picked up the pace and hurried down the tracks. They reached a fork in the path ahead. Without hesitation, Cat headed down the right-hand path which, he said, would lead them back onto the plate. His word was true. After a few minutes, the track began to slope gently upward. They reached the end shortly after and emerged at the entrance of the Sector 8 train station. Cat told them they could access the cannon by a fountain square at the foot of the Shinra building, so they left the train station and rushed towards the square. The square was, as expected, completely deserted. The citizens had left in a hurry, it seemed, wanting to get as far from the Shinra building as possible. In doing so they had abandoned many of their possessions, cars were still running, shopping had been dumped and left behind, and most shocking of all, they saw the body of a young man in the middle of the square. Unable to escape the panic fast enough, he had been trampled to death and left in the square. A number of streets ran off away from the square, and it was down one of these that they saw the access Cat had mentioned. It led to a stairwell that went straight up to the top of the cannon, which loomed over the sector. They stood in the center of the square and looked up at it. The pipes attached to the reactors were glowing in faint pulses as they carried small amounts of Mako into the cannon. Overhead there was the mainframe. Though they could not see Hojo from where they were, they knew he was there. Right now the mad scientist was working on opening up the next reactor. The companion made their way across the square. Just as they began to move, the ground began to shake once again. The companions stopped and froze in fright, fearing for a second that Hojo had already managed to open and activate the number 7 reactor. They soon realized that this was not the case, for the tremor was different from the one they had felt underground. It was heavier and came in regular bursts. Like footsteps. Something very large was heading towards them. The companions turned and looked back across the square. The sight they saw would haunt them forever. It was known as the Proud Clod, and was the Weapons Development Department's pride and joy. The automaton towered over the smaller buildings in the sector, and came just about level with the taller ones. It was covered from head to foot in red-tinted metal and had 4 monstrously large arms that were joined at the elbow and tipped with dangerously sharp titanium claws. 2 gigantic, flat feet with upturned claws stomped heavily along the pavement towards the square. Each step the Proud Clod took caused the ground to shake, and the pavement cracked beneath its weight. There was no doubt as to its intent, it was heading straight for them.
"This can't be,"
said Tifa.
"Are you serious?"
asked Yuffie. The ninja struggled to hide her smile. The Proud Clod certainly looked impressive. No doubt on the battlefield it would be an effective and fearsome weapon. But here, in a densely populated area, it just looked ridiculous. Shinra weren't really planning on using that thing here? Were they? The Proud Clod reached the end of the street and entered the square. It stopped in front of the group. There was a moment's pause and then a hatch on the robot's chest opened up. In the opening, standing side by side, were Heidegger and Scarlet. Heidegger laughed.
"Here they come. So they really showed up."
He laughed once more, and Scarlet laughed with him.
"You sure did treat us like dogs up to now. You killed off a lot of my precious soldiers,"
Scarlet added.
"But let's see how you do against anti-weapon artillery,"
said Heidegger, laughing again.
"You guys are worthless,"
Scarlet said.
"But my proud creations are a sure thing."
Scarlet smiled malevolently and then snapped her fingers. The chest hatch closed, sealing both her and Heidegger inside the robot. The Proud Clod raised one clenched fist and hit the ground in front of Cloud and his friends, forcing them to jump back. The group reached for their weapons, as Scarlet's voice cackled from inside.
I'll show you the destructive power of the proud clod.
With that, they began the attack. The proud clod bent its knees, revealing 2 large gun barrels hidden behind its caps, and then opened fire. Cloud and the others darted back as the bullets hit the ground in front of them. After the initial wave, the 6 machine gun barrels behind the automaton's small head also opened fire, sending another wave of bullets flying towards them, forcing them to retreat once again. 1 or 2 bullets ricocheted off the concrete floor and rebounded off the walls, zipping dangerously around the square. When the secondary wave of fire ended, the proud clod raised its clenched fist and smashed it into the ground where Tifa was standing. The young fighter flipped back out of the way and skidded to a stop. She looked over at Cloud.
Cloud.
Cloud heard her. There was no time to deal with Scarlet and Heidegger, or their proud clod. Even as they wasted time here, Hojo was getting closer and closer to completing his goal. At any moment the number 7 and 8 reactors could open, and then it would be lights out forever for Midgar. The swordsman released his hold on the Buster sword and stepped forward towards the proud clod.
This is pointless.
He called up to the robot, knowing that inside Scarlet and Heidegger could hear him.
It's over. There's no need for us to fight now.
Scarlet's high-pitched cackle echoed from within the proud cloud, and the automaton unleashed another volley of gunfire. The swordsman jumped back as the bullets tore into the ground at his feet. He drew his sword and used the wide blade as cover, and the bullets bounced off with a loud ping. When the volley ended, Cloud lowered his sword and tried again.
Scarlet,
he called.
If we don't stop Hojo, then Midgar is finished. Just let it go.
His answer was another round of intense gunfire, forcing the swordsman to retreat once more. He came to a stop beside Cat.
Don't waste your breath, Cloud,
the cat told him with a sigh.
They won't listen to you. All they care about now is proving that their machine can beat us into the ground. Our lives, the people of Midgar's lives. They mean nothing to them.
The cat stood up on the Mog's head, clutching his megaphone tightly in his gloved fist.
All Shinra ever cared about was its own interests, and protecting those interests. That's why soldier and people like Sephiroth were created. Fighting, money, power, that's all they ever cared about.
And didn't they know it? There was not a single one among them that had not been affected by Shinra's quest for power. Cat Shi, or Reeve Tusti, as an oppressed employee, Sid Highwind, whose dreams for space exploration were shattered by Shinra's greed, Yuffie Kisaragi, with her once proud home now a struggling tourist attraction, Vincent Valentine, genetically altered by Professor Hojo himself, Red 13, captured and experimented on as one of Hojo's specimens. Then there was Barrett, who lost all he held dear when Shinra destroyed his hometown and, in his rage, formed a resistance group to take his revenge. Likewise there was Tifa, whose father was killed by Sephiroth, her own life almost taken, and her hometown burned to the ground. An heiress. Relentlessly hunted by Shinra for many years, and eventually killed by Sephiroth. Lastly, there was Cloud. His involvement with Shinra was a story that did not need repeating, or reminding. It was deeply connected to their whole journey, and to the man whom they would eventually have to face, Sephiroth. That man was their goal. Shinra, Cloud realized with sudden clarity, was no longer part of their story. The proud clod stomped forward and brought its 2 right side fists down hard into the ground between him and Cat. The cat and Mog jumped back as the fist smashed right through the concrete floor, shattering the brickwork. The Mog lost its balance and fell forward onto its face, its feet and arms flailing. Cat Shi rolled over the ground until he came to a stop at Red 13's feet. The hound dipped his head and lifted the cat by the scruff of his neck, setting him back on his feet.
What about Midgar?
Tifa called up to the proud clod.
Don't you care what happens to it? If we don't stop Hojo and the cannon, then everybody will die. Including you.
The proud clod turned to face her. It raised its left arm and splayed the fingers of its second hand. The barrel of a laser cannon extended from its wrist and fired a hot beam of light towards her. Hurriedly Tifa ducked and rolled out of the way, while the laser beam ripped through the ground, tearing up more of the pavement. The fighter rose onto her feet in a single, swift movement and raised her fists. Before her, a high cackle and a low bellow echoed from within the proud clod. Still, they were laughing. Barrett came to stand beside her.
Cat's right, they don't care one bit about Midgar,
he said. He thought of little Marlene, sitting terrified in some household while panic and fighting raged around her.
Shinra never did. So let's just stop wasting time and get on with it. We got a city to save.
The former resistance leader pushed past Tifa, raised his gun arm, and opened fire upon the mech. The bullets bounced off the automaton's thick, strong armor, barely even denting it. Barrett cursed and then roared in rage as he tried again, firing more bullets, determined to break through. From inside the mech, Heidegger howled with laughter.
That's right, keep on firing.
He jeered.
Your weapons are useless against the Proud Claw's anti-weapon armor. Know what that means? Not even weapon could break this armor. Enough of this,
said Scarlet, growing bored of playing games with the rebels. She took hold of the control stick and pushed a red button on the top. The mechanisms deep inside the Proud Clawed whirred, and the mech suddenly knelt down on one knee. It leaned its large upper half forward and the mouth of its small head, which eerily resembled Genova, opened wide. Pipes leading from the fuel tanks to the head began to pump Mako, and the head's eyes began to glow. The prongs of the strange structure on its back also began to glow, before firing a long, wide beam of Mako energy towards the rebels. The shot, however, was poorly aimed and sailed cleanly over the heads of the rebels as they scrabbled to get out of the way. The beam hit one of the nearby shops, an item shop, and blew the building apart. The explosion ripped the building apart all the way down to its foundations. Shards of broken glass and chunks of brick and mortar went flying through the air. Smoke billowed, thick and choking, into the air. Smaller explosions occurred inside the remains of the shop, as the contents caught fire and blew up in colorful showers. Cloud looked over at the body of the young man who had been trampled during the panic. The body was now partially hidden beneath a pile of rock, all he could see was a bloodied arm and leg. Cat was right, there was no reasoning with people like Scarlet and Heidegger. Fighting. Money. And power. That was what Cat had said. Fighting only brought about more fighting, more pain, and more sadness. Would there ever be an end to such a cycle? Would the fighting ever end? Cloud drew his sword. There was only one way they could find out. And so, sword in hand, he ran forward to fight. The Proud Clawed, still leaning over, fired a second beam from its cannon. The swordsman did not stop but ducked down low beneath the beam, which sailed over his head. He could feel its destructive heat prickle against his skin and make him sweat. In his hands, the blade of the Buster sword began to glow a deep crimson, and the hilt became so hot it was almost unbearable. Instead of letting go, he simply tightened his grip, clenched his teeth against the pain, and carried on forward. Gunshots sailed through the air as Vincent and Barrett worked together to draw the Proud Clawed's attention. Using their fire and ice materia to magically enhance their bullets, they unleashed a continuous stream of bullets upon the Proud Clawed's chest plate. The Proud Clawed, in defense, took a single step backwards and raised an arm over its chest, protecting its occupants. With the Proud Clawed momentarily distracted, Cloud made a dash towards the Proud Clawed's other arm, which was hanging unguarded by its side. He saw movement at his side and turned to see Tifa running alongside him. Her fists were clenched and wreathed, spectacularly, in fire. It seemed she too had figured out what Cloud had begun to suspect about the Proud Clawed. The swordsman turned his attention back to the Proud Clawed. The arm was in range, and he swung his sword. The edge of the blade caught the joints of one of the Proud Clawed's arms. The blow hit with such intensity that sparks of white light appeared on contact. Cloud's lightning materia flashed white and electricity danced down the blade and onto the Proud Clawed. The electricity spread quickly, enveloping the automaton's whole arm and other hand. The arm stiffened as though in surprise, and from inside the Proud Clawed he heard Scarlet cry out in surprise. Tifa ran up beside him, and Cloud withdrew the blade, noting with interest that he had made a sizable dent in the Proud Clawed's armor. Perhaps it was not entirely impervious to weapons, after all. The Buster sword was made out of a special metallic alloy, one that perhaps outmatched the Proud Clawed. With her fists still wreathed in flame, Tifa struck the Buster sword's point of impact with all the strength she could summon, which was a lot. Cloud heard her knuckles crack as she struck the metal, and could only wonder what training she had endured to be able to muster such strength. The flames on her hands spread to the metal. The edges of the metal glowed white hot, until steam began to rise from the edges. The fighter then pulled her hand away, and with one more strike from the Buster sword, the hand came clean off. It clattered to the floor, the elongated metal claws still wriggling, until the Mako finally drained away and it became still. That was all the proof they needed. The Proud Clawed's anti-weapon armor was completely useless in the face of magic. On their own, their weapons would be ineffective. But when combined with the power of their magic materia, the Proud Clawed was defenseless. Heidegger and Scarlet, in their eagerness to produce a weapon so powerful that it was impervious to any gun or blade, had completely forgotten about its resistance to magic, something they had in abundance. It seemed that Heidegger and Scarlet had only just realized this. For a moment they were alarmed as they saw one of the Proud Clawed's indestructible arms lying severed on the ground. Then they relaxed. So what if an arm had been lost? They still would not defeat the proud clod. The robot lowered its other arm and started forward. It swiped at Vincent and Barrett, who stopped firing in order to dive aside out of the way of the hands that tried to snatch them off the ground. Vincent dropped to the ground and rolled back onto his feet in a single movement. Raising his gun, he fired a series of magic-enhanced bullets at the proud clod. The ice-encased bullets hit the proud clod's upper body, making dents and cracks in the armor. The proud clod swiped its arm and Vincent ducked once more, but once it passed he rose to his feet and continued to fire. 3 bullets hit one of the pipes that fed Mako energy into the cannon. The pipe cracked and shattered. Glowing Mako spewed out of the pipe, and one of the hands on the automaton's right side fell limp, devoid of power. The arm came within Cloud's range. Filling the blade with electricity once more, and calling upon the Bahamut materia for extra strength, Cloud jumped and brought the blade down on the proud clod's limp arm. With the electricity combined with Bahamut's strength, the Buster sword cut right through the nuts and bolts and severed the hand from the rest of the body. To Cloud's side, Sid thrust his spear into the joints of the proud clod's left ankle. The tip caught between the bolts and held fast, momentarily stalling the large robot. Quickly Sid withdrew the gravity materia from his pocket. He was just about to use it when one of the proud clod's remaining hands moved in and swept him aside in a single, easy movement. For a moment that felt like forever the pilot found himself flying through the air, his world spinning. There was a flash of gray and then green. He struck something hard and then fell, head first, into a pool of shallow water. Sid floundered in the water for a moment, before finally regaining his senses and struggling back to the surface. He broke through the surface and grabbed onto the patch of gray he had seen during his fall, the wall of the fountain. He wiped the water and blood from his eyes and looked ahead. His eyes widened. The proud clod was making its way towards him, moving with surprising speed considering its great size. Sid reached for his spear, but then remembered that the spear was still stuck tight in the proud clod's ankle. As the robot moved towards him the spear tip snapped, and the pole broke away. Red 13 ran in from the side, but the proud clod swiped him aside and kept on moving. An ice bullet hit the ground at the robot's feet. Ice spread across the ground, and when the proud clod's foot landed on the ice it skidded and slipped forward onto its knees in front of the fountain. The beam cannon on its back began to glow, and Sid scrabbled hurriedly backwards. Unable to escape the water fast enough, the pilot resorted to ducking down into the water once again. The cannon fired and the beam sailed overhead, striking the ground behind the fountain. Smoke swirled thickly into the air. The proud clod shuddered and started to rise to its feet again. 2 of the pipes leading up to the robot's face cracked and then shattered, unable to take the strain. It took an immense amount of power to move the automaton, let alone fire its incredible beam cannon. It would not be long before it ran out of power entirely. With the next 2 pipes shattered, the proud clod's entire left arm and leg fell limp. It tilted dangerously to one side but remained standing. Inside, Heidegger and Scarlet could be heard arguing heatedly. The proud clod jerked one way and then another, it seemed the 2 were fighting over control of the robot. Cloud, watching this, was reminded vaguely of an old saying he had heard once. Something about a divided house? The swordsman dropped to his knees, breathing hard. This was taking too long. If they didn't stop Heidegger and Scarlet's rampage soon, then Midgar would.
Hey, Cloud! Don't give up yet!
The swordsman looked up to find Cat standing close to him. The cat rubbed his nose and then held out his hand.
Give me that there lightning materia of yours, would you?
Cloud did as he was told and removed the lightning materia from his sword. He handed it to Cat, giving the cat a quizzical look. Cat She held the materia in his hands, passing it from palm to palm, as though testing it. Then he nodded, clasped it firmly in one hand, and then turned and ran across the square to where Barrett was busy firing obstinately at the proud clod.
Yo, Barrett!
The cat called as he ran.
Throw me at the chest plate!
Pausing in his gunfire, Barrett looked over at Cat. He saw the materia in the cat's hand and guessed what he had in mind. He turned. Cat jumped up and grabbed Barrett's outstretched hand. The big man then turned, spinning on the spot to build up momentum and then, with all his might, hurled the cat towards the proud clod. Cat She soared through the air, his arms and legs flailing. The proud clod zoomed in fast. He landed with a clank on the proud clod's head just below the face. He slid rapidly and scrabbled for a handhold. He eventually found one in the grid slits that covered the chest plate. Cat She peered through the slits, into the faces of Heidegger and Scarlet.
You!
Hissed Scarlet.
What are you doing, Reeve?
Cat refused to answer her. He wedged his boots into the slits below him and held the lightning materia up against the chest plate. He called upon the materia's power. Sparks of electric white light began to form around him, drawn like a magnet into the materia and condensing into a single, flickering ball of light. Some of the electricity escaped the confines of the materia and danced across his arms and legs, and over his face. His whiskers quivered and the cat shook his head vigorously.
"Stop, Reeve!"
roared Heidegger in alarm, realizing what Cat was up to. The materia flashed ready. Cat drew back his fist and slammed both it and the materia against the proud clod. The electricity was discharged upon contact and went zipping into the proud clod's main control room where Heidegger and Scarlet both sat. The two cried out and shielded their arms as the electricity zipped and flickered throughout the control room. The electricity danced over the consoles, sending powerful electric pulses racing through the proud clod. Cat meanwhile, was thrown back by the shockwave caused by the materia's release. The cat tumbled through the air, rolling over and over. Down on the ground, his Mog bounded forward and jumped up to catch him. Cat crashed into the Mog's large, round torso and dropped into its arms. The cat looked around dazedly for a moment, and then turned his head to look at the proud clod. Something was definitely wrong. The proud clod's body had fallen completely limp, supported only by the balance of its own feet. The mouth of the proud clod's face had fallen completely open, with mako pouring like blood from the orifice. Electricity crackled all over its body. Inside, Scarlet was desperately trying to regain control of her precious robot. She refused. Absolutely refused to accept that this band of pathetic wretches could defeat her. She stabbed buttons and pulled on knobs, turned dials and flicked switches, doing anything to get some kind of response. All the while Heidegger watched her, his brows so high up his forehead they looked about ready to take off. Scarlet eventually did get a reaction from the proud clod. It was not the reaction she wanted. The control console sparked and ignited, and flames gushed up in front of her. An alarm sounded inside the pod. The proud clod shuddered and shuffled backwards, back down the path it had come towards the train station.
"Not that!"
Scarlet cried, her eyes widening.
"This is the proud clod."
The shuddering intensified, until it looked like the robot was having some sort of extreme fit. The proud clod began to glow hotly, turning red first and then a fierce, hot white. Smoke poured from the chest plate. The robot stiffened.
"Hooah!"
Heidegger's voice cried from inside the clod. Cloud and the others braced themselves. The proud clod gave one final shudder, one last struggle for life. Then it fell still. And then exploded. The explosion rocked the sector, both above the plate and under it. Despite bracing themselves, the companions found themselves thrown aside in the blast. A wave of hot smoke and dust filled the square, blocking all vision and leaving them blind. They choked on the smoke, and their ears were deafened by the noise. Then, gradually, the sound of the blast faded away. The dust began to settle, the smoke drifted away. Cloud was the first to rise to his feet. The force of the explosion had left his body shaken, so he pushed the tip of the Buster sword into the broken ground and used it to pull himself to his feet. The sound of the blast still echoed painfully inside his head. He shook his head to clear it, and more dirt fell from his hair. Around him, the others were also beginning to stand. Sid finally climbed out of the fountain and walked unsteadily across the square to where the broken remains of his spear lay. All that was left was the broken pole, but it was better than nothing. Vincent offered Tifa a supporting hand and helped her to her feet. Cat climbed back on top of the Mog and shot a quick glance at the number 7 reactor. He sighed with relief. The reactor was still dark inside, which meant they still had time. He looked down the path to the burning remains of the proud clod. The chances of Scarlet and Heidegger surviving that blast would be next to none, but Cat did not feel too sad about that. He had never liked them, or the way they did things. It was not a great shame that the planet was, at last, free of their influence. A loud rumble sounded overhead. Cat tore his eyes away from the ruined mech and turned them to the darkened sky. It was beginning to rain. He could feel the first raindrops touch his face. More drops followed. Soon the sky was heavy with rain, falling thick and fast over the city. Another roll of thunder boomed, followed, seconds later, by a flash of lightning. Cat tapped the Mog on the head, and it began to hop across the square to the steps leading up to the cannon. He stopped at the top of the first set of stairs and turned back to Cloud and the others, who were following slowly behind.
"This way, Cloud!"
called Cat. He turned and began to hop up the steps again. Cloud hurried to catch up with him. Vincent fell into step behind him, following the swordsman up. The gunman's eyes were on the mainframe, some distance above them. He could not see Hojo, but he knew the professor was there. His hand strayed to his gun. It was loaded and ready. His thoughts went to Lucretia, sleeping soundly in her crystal stasis, never to awaken again. Vincent wondered. Lucretia had seen Sephiroth in her dreams. Was she watching them now? In her mind's eye, did she see this very moment approaching? Knowing what was about to occur, Vincent truly hoped that she wasn't. End of chapter. Episode 39, Part 14, Chapter 37. Chapter 37. After a few minutes of tiring climbing, the companions finally neared the top of the Sister Ray. By this point the storm had now fully settled over the city, and though it was only early evening, the thick, black clouds gave the impression that it was already late in the night. The upper platforms creaked loudly as the storm's strong winds blew fiercely around them. The rain had eased off slightly, but not before it had soaked the companions through almost to the skin. Cat stood at the top of the stairs, waiting impatiently for the rest of his friends to climb the last few steps. When they finally reached the top, Yuffie dropped to her knees, exhausted by the long climb. The others were also tired, for there had been no time to rest following the battle with the proud Claude. But their task was far from over, and Cat allowed them only a moment's rest to catch their breath before urging them forward once again. The mainframe was just ahead. They saw Professor Hojo, standing with his back to them, working diligently away even as the wind and the rain buffeted the platform. Cloud and the others ran out onto the mainframe and stopped behind the professor. Though they did not anticipate a battle, they drew their weapons anyway, to present a show of force.
Hojo! Stop right there!
Hojo paused in his work just long enough to turn his head around and glance over his shoulder. He did not seem particularly surprised to see them there, and also did not seem the least bit perturbed when he saw that they had drawn their weapons. The professor quickly scanned the group, analyzing them in a moment, before his eyes finally settled on Cloud. His brow creased and he frowned.
Oh! The failure,
he said after a moment's pause, seemingly reminding himself. Cloud scowled.
At least remember my name,
he said.
It's Cloud.
Looking into the professor's face, Cloud got the feeling that something was wrong. Professor Hojo looked a little off color. Perhaps it was just the fatigue setting in, or the strange storm clouds overhead, but it made the professor look almost jaundiced. The swordsman dismissed it as his tired mind playing tricks on him. Hojo waved a hand dismissively and turned back to the mainframe. He stretched out his hand to slowly and carefully twist one of the dials, speaking as he worked.
Every time I see you, he said, it pains me that I had so little scientific sense. I evaluated you as a failed project. But, you are the only one that succeeded as a Sephiroth clone. Ha, ha, ha.
The professor chuckled at the bitter memory.
I'm beginning to hate myself. None of that matters,
said Cloud.
Just stop this nonsense. Nonsense?
Repeated Hojo, confused.
Oh, this.
Hojo finally stopped working and turned around to face the group, folding his hands neatly behind his back. Now that they stood face to face, Cloud once again got the feeling that there was something undeniably wrong with him. The professor's face had a distinct yellowish hue and his eyes, behind his glasses, were somewhat glazed. Beads of sweat dotted his brow. Yet Professor Hojo seemed to be completely unaware of all this. Either unaware or no longer cared.
Sephiroth seems to be counting on the energy,
Hojo said, ignoring the gasps of surprise at his face. He turned and waved his hand, gesturing to the 5 glowing reactors and the 2 dark ones around the city.
So I'm going to lend him a hand. Why?
Demanded Cloud angrily. He stepped forward.
Why do that?
Hojo looked at him and scowled.
Quit asking why, you moron,
he snapped fiercely. Then he stopped himself and looked at Cloud appraisingly, pushing his glasses up.
Actually, you might be cut out to be a scientist,
he added thoughtfully. Still thinking, Hojo turned back to the mainframe and leaned over it to look at one of the readouts.
Energy level is at 83%,
he said to himself.
It's taking too long.
He began to work again. Cloud's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword, and he took a step forward. Tifa quickly caught up to him and placed her fingers gently on his arm. Feeling her touch, Cloud stopped. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. It would do them no good for him to lose his temper here. They had to reason with Hojo. Somehow dissuade him from this course of action. Then Hojo said something that caused the blood in his veins to freeze over.
My son is in need of power and help. That's the only reason.
There was a long pause.
Your son?
Asked Cloud, breaking the silence. A cold, cruel smile touched Hojo's lips.
Although he doesn't know,
he added. He laughed to himself, a combination of bitterness and humor.
What will Sephiroth think when he finds out I'm his father? Always looking down on me like that.
He laughed again and turned another dial on the console. The top of the number 7 reactor slowly opened up, and a faint, greenish glow radiated from inside. There was another long pause. For a moment no one could really take it in. As the meaning of those words finally sank in, they all gasped in horror, staring at Hojo. Cloud's eyes widened.
Sephiroth is your son?
He cried. Vincent ran forward to stand by Cloud, his red eyes wild. Hojo laughed, amused at their surprise.
I offered the woman with my child to Professor Gast's Genova project,
he told them. He paused and looked up at the dark sky. A bead of sweat trickled down his face.
When Sephiroth was still in the womb, we took the cells of Genova.
He let the sentence hang, and he laughed. Vincent, hearing this, shook his head. This. He had never known. He tried to find words that were strong enough to convey the pain and anguish that he felt right then. All these years he had waited. And now, at the crucial moment, words escaped him.
You.
Was all he could say. Lucretia, he knew, was Sephiroth's mother, his biological mother. Though, as far as Sephiroth was concerned, his mother was Genova. The father, Vincent had never considered. He had assumed a donor had been found to participate in the Genova project. Not once did it occur to him that Lucretia might have. Pain gripped Vincent's heart so tightly that he feared he might collapse. Had he inadvertently driven Lucretia so far that she would willingly bear this man's child, to be used in a scientific experiment? And through that experiment, Lucretia herself had been injected with Genova's cells. Guilt and shame swelled inside him. Oh, those familiar feelings, they were second nature to him now. Yet now those feelings were tinged with another feeling, anger. Anger directed at the man who stood before him now. Hojo was actually laughing. Laughing. After all the pain he had caused. Not only to Lucretia, but to himself, Cloud. In fact, everyone who had ever come into contact with this deranged man. His hand went to his gun, his fingers twitching.
I can't believe you're the one who did this,
said Cloud, cutting into Vincent's thoughts.
The illusionary crime against Sephiroth.
Hojo stopped his work and turned to face the companions again. He was still laughing.
No, you're wrong,
he said.
It's my desire as a scientist.
And he laughed again. And again. It was a horrible, cackling laugh. Its sound pierced through the falling rain and even the rolling thunder, like something out of a horror film. A bolt of lightning lit the sky, almost immediately followed by a clap of thunder so loud it deafened them. The wind picked up, blowing the long lengths of Hojo's lab coat around his rain-soaked body. All the while, Hojo laughed uncontrollably. A dark realization dawned in Vincent's eyes. For 30 years he had slept in that coffin in Shinra Mansion, dreaming of his sins and his shame, believing that he alone was responsible for what happened to Lucretia. He had not been strong enough to stop her from taking part in the Genova project. He who had driven her into this man's arms. Now she slept an eternal sleep in a case of crystal, waiting for the Genova cells that kept her alive to finally allow her to die. But here before him, he realized now, was the real perpetrator of Lucretia's suffering. It was Hojo who had succeeded where Vincent had failed, persuading Lucretia to bear the child that would be used in the experiment. Vincent's shame was that he could not stop her, but this man's sin was far greater.
I was wrong,
said Vincent softly. He closed his eyes. Lucretia's image came to him, as it always did, though now her image was encased in crystal. Once more he apologized and slowly drew his gun.
The one who should have slept was.
His eyes flared open.
You, Hojo.
Hojo's laughter finally stopped. His smile, that cold, cruel, insane smile, continued to twist his face. Sweat, mixed with raindrops, rolled down his jaundiced face until they rolled off the point of his chin. His eyes, gazed with a burning fear, gazed at the group in bitterness and loathing.
I was defeated by my desire to become a scientist,
he admitted finally.
I lost the last time as well.
He took a few steps forward. His smile widened and he chuckled once again. His chuckle grew in volume until it became a manic, cackling laugh.
I've injected Genova cells into my own body,
he announced gleefully.
He. Here are. He. My results.
The professor stretched out his hands. To the companions' horror, they saw that the skin of his hands was bubbling, as though dipped in acid. Droplets of green-yellow ooze dripped from his fingertips and onto the floor. There it bubbled and thickened, congealing into a thick, gooey mass at the professor's feet. A foul, acrid stench filled the air. The companions covered their noses and watched in growing revulsion as the ooze began to swell and rise from the ground, forming into a shapeless, gelatinous mass. The mass stretched and split into two before finally taking shape, into the form of two monsters of Hojo's own design. The first monster, on Hojo's left, was a poodler sample. The monster resembled the crustacean monsters that patrolled the shores of the Costa Plains, with a hard shell and three long, thick tentacles that waved about tentatively in search of food. On Hojo's right was the second monster, known as a bad rap. The bad rap could only be described as a large, inflated octopus that hovered 6 inches off the ground. Its own tentacles waved about beneath its inflated body, endlessly searching for prey. Ooze dripped slowly off the monsters' bodies, and as they watched the ooze gradually thinned and evaporated. The beady eyes of the bad rap flickered this way and that, and the poodler, sensing prey, stretched its 3 tentacles eagerly in their direction. Neither moved, however, as Hojo held them in thrall. The professor snapped his now normal fingers, and the 2 monsters surged forward. Quickly Cloud raised his sword and slashed it down in front of him as the poodler pulled ahead of its slower compatriot and threw itself into a powerful body slam. The monster's hard outer shell smashed into the flat side of the buster sword's blade. Cloud winced as pain shot up his arm to his shoulder, almost wrenching it out of the socket. He gritted his teeth against the pain and pushed against the blade, keeping the monster at bay. There was a flash of green as the bad rap moved right past him and headed towards Yuffie, who was nearest. Its tentacles moved about fervently, reaching for her. The ninja leaped out of the way of the roaming tentacles and threw her shuriken, but it missed and zipped soundly past. Barrett raised his gun to take it down, but Red 13 ran in front of the monster, blocking his aim. Red 13 snarled and leaped at the monster, jaws open, ready to tear it apart. The bad rap flicked one of its tentacles and caught the hound on the shoulder. Red 13 yelped in pain and fell onto the floor. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him. He began to shudder violently as the poison spread quickly throughout his body. Cat saw Red 13 fall. The cat quickly turned and rummaged about in the storage compartment in the mog's back. Potion, elixir. Aha! Cat found the bottle he was looking for. There came the heavy drone of gunfire as Barrett opened fire upon the advancing bad rap, roaring in anger as he did so. Cat grasped the antidote bottle firmly in one hand before he jumped off the mog and hurried toward Red 13. Cloud, meanwhile, was still struggling with the poodler. After realizing that it could not smash its way through the buster sword, it wrapped 2 of its tentacles tightly around the blade and refused to let go. The third tentacle snaked along Cloud's arm, dripping ooze and heading for Cloud's unprotected neck. Cloud tried to use the lightning materia to halt the monster in its tracks, but nothing happened. Then he remembered, he had thrown the materia to Cat during the previous battle. For a moment he wondered if he should let go of the sword to defend himself, but that meant giving up his weapon. And he could not do that. Beside the main frame, Hojo watched with absolute glee as the poodler's tentacle wound its way around Cloud's neck. The poodler began to squeeze, and Cloud gasped. He put all his strength into his arms as he tried to push the monster away from him, but the poodler had a very strong grip and would not budge. In the end Cloud reluctantly let go of the buster sword and attempted to pry the tentacle from his neck. Seeing that he had released his sword, the poodler also let go and began to wind its 2 tentacles around Cloud's arms, tightening around his wrists and pulling them free. Cloud! Tifa ran up behind the poodler. She grabbed onto the edge of its ribbed shell and pulled. The poodler screeched in protest. It released its hold on Cloud's wrists and instead wrapped them right around the swordsman's neck. The swordsman pulled on the tentacles, but the ooze made the flesh slippery. He could not get a grip. Tifa was getting nowhere either. She let go of the shell and moved around to Cloud's side. The poodler's tiny head, just beneath the shell, turned to look at her. Tifa met the monster's gaze, scowled, and then drew back her fist. She punched, and her fist smashed right through the shell and into the squishy contents inside. The poodler screeched and its whole body shuddered in pain. More ooze and black blood spurted out of the hole Tifa made, spilling over her hands and arms. The poodler gave another violent shudder, its body stiffened like a stick. Its eyes then rolled back into its head and it fell limp. The tentacles around Cloud's neck slackened, and the swordsman shoved them away. Behind them the bad rat lunged at Yuffie once more, waving its numerous, poison-tipped tentacles. And once again Yuffie leaped backwards. Her shuriken, after completing its circuit of the upper level, had returned to her hand and now she threw it again in a more concise arc towards the monster. The crystal-tipped edges sliced through 3 of the monster's tentacles, these dropped to the floor and flapped about like fish out of water. The bad rat, however, seemed completely unfazed by the loss of its limbs. It also did not seem bothered by the bullet wounds that covered its body. It continued to make its way steadily towards her, its tiny eyes fixed upon her. A small slit its mouth appeared in the middle of its face. The slit grew wider, taking up almost all of its face. When it opened its mouth Yuffie saw row upon row of tiny, jagged teeth, dripping with saliva and chomping hungrily. The bad rat lunged again, its mouth open wide. At the same time Barrett finished clearing a jam in his gun arm and fired a test round at the bad rat. The shot ripped open a large, bloody wound in the bad rat's flesh, leaking green-black blood. The monster gave a jolt and temporarily paused, its eyes darting left and right. Its mouth closed. The monster then slowly turned around to face Barrett. It stared at him for a moment, and then suddenly lurched at him. Barrett made to raise his gun arm, but the bad rat moved with such surprising swiftness that he could not raise it fast enough. The monster's mouth opened and it clamped its jaws around Barrett's good arm. Barrett gave a pained cry as dozens of tiny teeth sank into his flesh. He felt the hot trickle of blood down his arm. Through the hazy pain Barrett saw the monster's tentacles reaching for him. Barrett gritted his teeth and thrust out his arm, keeping the monster at arm's length. Then he raised his gun arm, took aim, and fired a single shot at the monster's head, right between its eyes. The bullet struck home. The bad rat gave a gargled cry as it was thrown back, leaving more than one of its teeth embedded in Barrett's blood-soaked arm. Though the shot should have killed it outright, the monster continued to live, although its movements were jerky and strained. Barrett was about to open fire on it again when Sid brushed him aside with a casual remark about him hogging all the fun. The pilot walked just as casually up to the struggling creature and, with a flick of his wrist, thrust the broken ends of spear into the creature's head. The jagged edges cut through the flesh easily and the bad rat shrieked in pain. It fell to the floor, still writhing. Sid placed one boot gently on its wriggling body and pushed down on the spear until it touched metal on the other side. The bad rat's blood-filled mouth quivered and then fell still. A second later the monster began to dissolve, turning back into yellowish ooze that sank through the grating and out of sight. Sid lifted his spear, wrinkling his nose in disgust. Hojo watched the skirmish with interest. The smile on his face widened. Sweat was dripping profusely down his yellowish face, his shirt and trousers were damp with it. He laughed gleefully as he saw Sid wipe his spear clean, Red 13 slowly stagger to his feet with Katshi's help, and as Cloud and Tifa lifted the poodler's corpse and toss it unceremoniously over the side of the railings. Yes, he thought, as he saw the ease with which the rebels had dispatched the monsters he had summoned. Yes. This was just what he expected of them. His eyes were then drawn to Vincent, who stepped forward to stand before him. The gunman had made no move during the course of the battle, and had instead spent the time staring closely at Hojo. Their eyes met. Vincent's face was partially hidden behind the tall collar of his cloak, and the long lengths of his dark hair framed his face. His eyes, however, were clearly visible. Those eyes. Hojo remembered those eyes clearly. They had glared at him back then, too. That same angry, defiant glare. Here was another failed experiment. Just as Hojo was thinking this, Vincent's body glowed brightly, as he began to transform into one of the many beasts that had had air DNA infused with his. The professor raised an arm to shield his eyes. When the light faded, he lowered his arm and peered out. When he did, he almost gasped. The beast that Vincent had chosen was Chaos. Hojo's eyes widened. And then his look of shock twisted into a cruel and evil grin. A dozen thoughts and memories flashed through his mind at once. A bead of sweat trickled down his nose and dripped off the end as the professor made up his mind. So be it. The rest of the rebels gathered around Chaos and stood facing Hojo. Each of them had the same defiant look in their eyes, strong and unwavering. The professor, chuckling, removed his glasses.
Ha!
He laughed.
Now let's see how the Mako juice is reacting.
The professor spread his arms wide. Steam rose from his hands, his arms, and his face. The skin bubbled and began to melt into a sickening, foul-smelling ooze. The professor threw back his head and laughed manically as his body began to twist and bend, warping into something hideous and inhuman. Bones cracked and reshaped. Skin was stretched and twisted, splitting and shredding to reveal the muscles growing underneath. The professor's lab clothes were ripped apart by his rapidly deforming body, falling in loose shreds at his feet. Those same feet quickly vanished, melting into the rest of his body. All the while the professor laughed, even as his body twisted and stretched, and blood slipped through the open wounds caused by his splitting skin. Eventually even his face became deformed as his lower jaw was stretched wide open, until his face became a grotesque mask of horror. His eyes became hollow and dead. Folds of flesh hit the floor, and the newly created Helladic Hojo leaned heavily to one side. His two arms, massive and heavy, dragged against the floor. The companions could only watch in terror as Hojo's transformation was completed. The elongated head, thrown back in laughter, slowly raised and settled its dark gaze upon them. They each felt a cold chill down their spines as the hollowed, empty eyes fell on them, but they stood firm, refusing to waver now. Chaos reached into his holster and drew out his gun. The barrel clicked as it loaded. In a deep voice, he said,
"Let's finish this."
End of chapter. Episode 40, Part 14, Chapter 38. Chapter 38. The storm over Midgar was growing stronger with each passing moment. The clouds, tinted red by meteors' burning light, cast eerie red shadows over the city. The 5 Mako reactors currently active continued to glow as more and more Mako was forcibly sucked from beneath the planet's crust. Alarms rang out in warning, and every so often the city was shaken by strong tremors as the planet protested. In the streets, the panic had grown out of control. The citizens had given up trying to fight their way past the soldiers and now flooded the streets, trying to find other ways to escape the doomed city. Some had given up all hope of escape and turned their fear and rage upon the city, using sticks and bats to smash up cars, windows, anything they could lay their hands. Overwhelmed by fear, there was nothing else that they could do. Their actions were pointless, but to them it was better than sitting and waiting to die. The soldiers protecting the Shinra building had also abandoned their posts at this point, choosing to save themselves and their families now that everything else seemed hopeless. With nobody left to guard the doors, numerous terrified employees quickly made their escape and ran out into the blowing wind and pouring rain, hoping to find some means of escape amidst the panic. High up overhead, a bolt of lightning streaked across the sky. Just like the clouds, the bolt was also tinted a deep red. Its light lit the sister ray in a flash of crimson light, and anyone looking up at that moment could just make out, in that flash, the terrifying battle that was ensuing above them. Helladic Hojo, the bizarre, deformed monster created by the mutation of the Genova cells, was the fiercest opponent the companions had ever faced. After the almost trivial clash with the Poodler and the bad rap, they had felt confident in their ability to win. They did not believe that Hojo could be any worse. They had been utterly, horribly wrong. Despite his malformed body, Hojo was monstrously strong. The cells that he had injected into his body had granted him unbelievable strength that was equal to or greater than of any member of Soldier. Almost like Sephiroth himself. And as well as being granted great physical strength, Genova's cells had also given Hojo great magical strength. Yet it was his physical strength that Hojo preferred, and used to great effect against the companions. Helladic Hojo raised his right arm, which was swollen and shaped like a hammer, and swung it across him, aiming to strike Tifa as she charged in for an assault. The fighter ducked down, letting the arm sail overhead, but when she rose to continue her charge, the arm suddenly swung back and caught her in the chest. The fighter cried out, her breath escaping her, as she was flung to the side. She slammed hard into a water container, denting the metal, and slumped to the floor. With his attention elsewhere, Sid ran in from the other side and thrust out his broken spear. Without even turning his head, Hojo lifted his 3-pronged left hand to block the attack. The broken ends of the spear fell sank deep into the flesh. Black-green blood seeped out of the wound, but Hojo did not seem to feel it. Sid, cursing, tried to yank the pole out again, but found that it would not move. Now Hojo's head turned, moving erratically, and looked at him. As those sightless, empty eyes fell on him, the pilot froze in fear. Hojo's long, open mouth twitched and saliva dripped hungrily, a hunger the professor would never be able to satisfy. With an angry roar, Hojo swung his right arm and knocked the pilot aside. Sid hit the ground and rolled, leaving his spear stuck in the monster's hand. Cloud was running up behind. When he neared Hojo, he jumped into the air, raising his sword above his head. Mercilessly, he brought it down on Hojo's right shoulder, hoping to sever the swinging arm. The blade hit the flesh and sliced through, sinking in about 5 inches before stopping and becoming stuck in the flesh. Cloud yanked on the blade, but like Sid's pole it would not budge. He then noticed a black-green, bubbling liquid was seeping out of the wound, sticking to the blade like glue and holding it in place. Even the Helatic's mutated blood was a weapon. Sensing the annoyance behind him, Hojo started to reach behind with his left arm to give the swordsman a painful, magic-enhanced jab. Red 13 leaped over Sid and pounced on the arm, pinning it to the floor and pulling Hojo down on one side. The pole snapped again. Red 13 closed his jaws around the arm. Black-green blood filled his mouth and he gagged, but he refused to let go. Now Hojo was leaning precariously over to his left, with his right arm still swinging in the air. Chaos swooped down from above and fired, ripping a hole through the hammer's flesh. Following Chaos's lead, Barret opened fire and unleashed a volley of ice bullets at Hojo. The Helatic raised its right arm and used it to shield his face from the bullets. The ice bullets ripped through the flesh but could not pierce it all the way through, and the thick blood running through Hojo's veins stopped the ice from taking effect. When Barret paused to reload his gun, the Helatic thrust out its arm. The skin and muscles stretched like elastic, reaching out for Barret. Barret saw the arm approaching and quickly jumped back just as the hammer-like fist smashed into the ground. It smashed right through the metal grating, leaving a giant hole in its wake, before slowly retreating back to the main body. Barret skidded to a stop, finished reloading his gun, and opened fire once more. There was a blur as Yuffie darted past him, determined not to be left out of the action. She had a shuriken in each hand, and when Barret paused in his assault she leaped into the air and hurled the conformer away from her. The shuriken made a loud whistling sound as it zipped through the air. It struck Hojo in his right arm right next to where Cloud was still struggling to free the Buster's sword. The conformer cut through the sticky strands of blood and Cloud pulled his blade free. Yuffie landed on Hojo's outstretched arm, which was sliding slowly along the grating. She ran along the arm, her boots bouncing slightly on the stretched out skin to the shoulder. Whipping out her second shuriken, she swiped it across Hojo's face. The shuriken's blade sliced easily through the flesh, moving so fast the blood that spurted out did not have time to stick. Yuffie whipped her shuriken back, grinning. Movement caught her eye. On Hojo's other side, the Helatic began to drag its left arm up to strike her, with Red 13 still attached. The ninja held her arm with the shuriken behind her back as jumped out of the way, flipping up and over. Red 13 lost his grip as the arm moved over and dropped down behind Hojo. Yuffie landed on Hojo's other shoulder, dropped down low and sliced her shuriken again. She caught Hojo on the other side of his face, and more blood shot into the air. Hojo screamed. It was a terrifying, high-pitched scream. It resonated in the very deepest recesses of the brain, making it almost impossible to blot out. Yuffie clamped her hands over ears. Her foot slipped and she fell backward, landing in Cloud's arms as he reached out to catch her. The swordsman was also on his knees, eyes shut tight as he tried to ignore the terrible sound. At that moment Tifa was just struggling to her feet. She took a few uneasy steps forward, her head pounding. When Hojo screamed, she put her hands over her ears and dropped onto her knees. Her vision swam and she feared that she might pass out. Her thoughts reeled. What was going on? What was that awful sound? A pair of hands closed over her ears. Tifa lifted her head and saw a black and white cat with a golden crown on its head standing in front of her.
Tifa,
a voice was saying, and the cat's mouth moved.
Tifa, hold on. Don't listen.
Tifa blinked. She shook her head again. Her head ached painfully, as though she had hit it hard. A dull, fuzzy sensation washed over her. She looked up at the cat again. Who was this cat? Was it her enemy? The cat's head turned away from her and shouted something over its shoulder. The horrible scream had stopped, but Tifa could still hear it ringing inside her head. Her eyes flitted back and forth warily. There were more figures nearby, all of them moving. There was the clash of metal and the dull, droning sound of gunfire. Tifa realized then that she was surrounded by enemies, all of them fighting amongst themselves. If she struck quick, then maybe she could. The cat still was not watching her. Cautiously, she drew back her fist. The cat turned back. And she punched him right in the face. The cat cried out, his paws over his nose. He staggered back and then fell to the floor, stunned. Tifa took her chance. She climbed to her feet and rushed into the fray. Her head was pounding as she moved, and there was a nagging voice somewhere inside that was telling her something was wrong, but she ignored it and carried on forward. She had to destroy these unknown enemies before they destroyed her. She ran to the nearest of the unknown figures. All she could see was a blur of blue and yellow. Grabbed him by his shoulder and spun him around to face her. She punched, caught the foe on the chin and sent him hurtling backward. Without waiting for him to recover, Tifa dived onto the figure. She pinned him down and began to punch him repeatedly, her dark eyes blazing. Over the sound of the gunshots she thought she heard someone call her name, but in her confusion she could not understand. The figure below her tried to stop her by grabbing her hands, but Tifa just wrenched her arms free and kept on punching.
Tifa! Snap out of it!
Another voice, followed by a grunt and a thud as something large and fleshy in the corner of Tifa's vision swept it aside. Cloud rolled onto his knees, dodging another hammer blow from Hell-Edic Hojo. He looked over at Tifa. Hojo's terrifying scream had caused the fighter to become confused, a terrible state where the victim was no longer able to distinguish friend from foe. As he watched, Sid tried once more to grab her hands and stop her onslaught, and Barrett called out her name, trying to snap her out of it. Eventually the big man was forced to stop firing at Hojo and ran over to her. He hooked his arms under hers and dragged her off.
Tifa!
Called Barrett. She turned to face him, her fist raised to strike him across the face. Quickly Barrett raised his gun arm, and her fist thudded hard against it. Holding her by the arms, he gave her a shake.
Snap out of it, Tifa!
He shook her again. Tifa stared at him, her expression fuzzy. Then she blinked repeatedly and shook her head. The ringing scream faded, and her thoughts finally cleared. She looked up at Barrett, who was relieved to see recognition in her eyes.
Barrett!
Tifa said, now confused on another level.
What happened? You almost beat me to a pulp is what happened,
Sid groaned, struggling to his feet. He touched his jaw, which was sore. That was going to bruise. A guilty look passed over Tifa's face as she remembered.
Oh, Sid. I'm so sorry.
Cloud's voice cut through their exchange.
Get down.
Hojo had seen the three standing together and had thrust out both of his arms. The elastic-like skin of his arms stretched, reaching for them. Barrett grabbed Tifa and pulled her aside, and Sid dived out of the way as the two hands crashed into the ground where they had been standing. The fist smashed through the grating and also through the pipes that ran along underneath. Clouds of hot steam, thick with the stench of Mako, billowed into the air. Hell-Edic Hojo howled in agony as the piping hot steam burned his hands. He pulled on his arms, trying to draw them back, but they were caught on the grating. So instead he howled in pain. Cloud rose to his feet and heaved his sword onto his back. A glancing blow by one of the arms had left him winded, and he was only just getting his breath back. There was no time for him to rest, however. With Hojo's arms temporarily immobilized, they had a chance to strike. He held his sword level before him, and then charged. Cloud slashed the blade in an upward arc and struck the underside of Hojo's left shoulder. Following Yuffie's example, he kept the blade moving, not allowing it to slow lest the glue-like blood caused it to stick in place again. He pushed and the blade eventually cut right through. He saw the stretched-out muscles of the arm snap with a loud twang and the arm jerked forward. It was attached only by a thin layer of stretched-out skin. Cloud swung his sword once more and severed the arm completely. It shot forward a few feet, like a released rubber band, before dropping onto the floor. Hojo shrieked and turned to Cloud. He started to shuffle forwards but stopped as Red 13 landed on his back, dug in his claws and sank his teeth into his neck. Hojo finally managed to detach his right hand from the floor and brought it back, raised, to knock the hound from his back. Red 13 saw it coming and nimbly leaped out of the way. The arm, however, was moving too fast and swung over Hojo's shoulder, striking him in his own misshapen back. Hojo lurched forward. Cloud saw his chance. He raised his blade over his head and brought it down on Hojo's head. The Hell-Edic pulled its head back at the last second. Unwinding his arm, he swung it at Cloud, who jumped back. As he did with Tifa, Hojo tried to swing his arm back and catch Cloud off guard, but was stopped as Yuffie ran in and met the oncoming fist with a punch of her own. She added to her punch the strength of the earth materia, and its strong vibrations caused the hand to stop in its tracks. A shot fired from above as Chaos finally saw his opening. With an absolutely perfect aim, he fired 3 shots into Hojo's remaining arm. Muscles were severed and blood shot into the air. But the arm was still moving, even with half the muscles severed. While Hojo screamed in rage, Tifa, now recovered from her confusion, rushed in and gave Hojo a punch in his jaw. There was a crunch as the bones were crushed beneath her might, and Hojo's was thrust backward. Just as he was heading back, Red 13 leaped onto his back, sending Hojo careening forward again until he was within range of Cloud's sword. The swordsman swung his sword, but even through the blood and pain Hojo was still aware and pulled his head out of the way. The blade crashed into the floor, damaging only the grating. Barrett fired round after round. The ice materia was all used up, so he was forced to use ordinary bullets, but these were enough. They tore through Hojo's swinging arm, completing the job that Chaos had started and severing the last of the muscles that allowed the arm to move. The arm fell limp at Hojo's side, swinging loosely. Once again, Hojo shrieked as both of its arms became useless. Cloud ran in front of him and slashed his sword, cutting a long and bloody gash across Hojo's chest. The Hell-Addict reeled backwards, grasping for breath. Yuffie, behind Hojo, swiped her shuriken along the base of Hojo's spine. The flesh here was tougher and she could not cut completely through, but it was enough to send Hojo toppling forward and straight into the arms of Chaos. Chaos had descended from the sky and caught Hojo as he fell forward. Hojo slowly raised his misshapen, elongated head and looked at Chaos through sightless, hollowed eyes. Chaos stared back at him, his face cold and expressionless. Chaos then gripped Hojo by his neck and held him up at arm's length. The two continued to stare at each other. Around them, Cloud and the others held back, letting the silent exchange continue. Hojo tried to speak, but Chaos silenced him by tightening his grip around the deformed professor's throat. No, Hojo was not a professor anymore. He was just a monster, plain and simple. Chaos raised his gun and pressed the barrel lightly against Hojo's forehead. His lips closed into a firm, steady line. He fired. The bullet went straight through Hojo's head and came out the other side. The force threw Hojo's head back, wrenching it from Chaos's hand. A small spray of black-green blood burst from the wound. The monster's body went flying back, carried by the force of the shot. The companions quickly separated as the Hell-Addict's body slammed into the floor. Its head rolled onto one side, dead. Chaos glowed white, and Vincent returned to his normal form. He spun the gun once and then placed it back in its holster.
"It's over,"
he said and then turned away. He started to walk across the platform towards the stairs, leaving the corpse behind.
"Not quite."
The voice was rasping and guttural. Vincent stopped. He looked back over his shoulder. His friends were staring at the corpse in horror and drawing steadily back. Hojo was still alive. Even though the shot had ripped a hole through his brain, the Genova cells inside of him were so strong that they refused to let him die so easily. The Hell-Addict's body shuddered and began to rise up off the floor. The bullet wound in its head rippled and closed. The head snapped up with a crack, staring at Vincent. The wounds that had been inflicted upon it bubbled blood. The flesh stretched and then split open with a sickening rip. Bones cracked apart, and organs dripped onto the floor. Tifa screamed and clung to Barrett's arm. A bulge appeared at the bloodied stump of Hojo's left shoulder. It swelled and burst open with a spray of black-green blood. The spray narrowly missed Red 13, who sniffed it and then growled menacingly. The scent was tainted and disgusting, like something rotting from the inside. A tentacle emerged from the burst swelling. It wiggled about before sliding out fully with a slurping sound. It slid until it touched the floor, dripping liquid. A second bulge appeared above the shoulder of the immobilized right arm. This too burst open and the right arm dropped down onto the floor, severed. A second tentacle, shorter than the first, slid out of the opening. The Hell-Addict's rear end broke away and a tail slid out, waving back and forth eagerly. Cloud lowered his sword and stared in open-mouthed horror as Hojo then leaned far back. The flesh of his chest split open further and unfolded like a jacket, slipping off the shoulders and falling into a bloody, messy pile on the floor. What was left behind rose up, shaking itself free of the remains. This new life form showed no resemblance to Hojo at all. If anything, Hojo was all but gone. The mutated Genova cells he had injected into his bloodstream had taken him over completely, leaving nothing but a monster behind. This monster looked very much like a ghoul out of Nightmare with skin that was a dark, lifeless gray, but with bands of yellow around its waist and over its head. It had no hands or feet, just two smooth, long tentacles for arms and a thick tentacle that was its tail. The Hojo life form raised its head. Its face was smooth and almost featureless, covered by what looked like a thin layer of metal. Like the Hell-Addict, it had no eyes, just empty, flat eye sockets. Yet some malevolent was peering out at them, they could feel its cold stare moving over them. Its chest rose, and a deep growl rumbled from inside its throat. The life form paused, taking them in, and then attacked. The life form moved at surprising speed, far faster than they would have expected it to, and slammed its body hard into Vincent, who was directly ahead. The gunman fell back onto the grating with the life form on top of him. His gun slipped out of its holster and clattered across the floor. Red 13 turned to Barrett, who was just raising his gun.
"No, don't,"
the Hound called to him in warning.
"You might hit Vincent."
The resistance leader stopped, hesitant. The life form was so close to Vincent, it was possible he could miss, or a bullet could ricochet and hit the gunman instead. Barrett waited, his gun arm raised, keeping his eyes peeled for an opening. Tifa had no such restrictions, and as such she darted in. She only managed to land a couple of punches before the life form flipped its tentacle tail and knocked her off her feet. As she fell, the life form wrapped its tail around her ankle and with a single effortless flick sent her flying backwards. Cloud ran in to catch her. She slammed into him hard, winding him. He staggered back and fell against the mainframe, winded. Tifa, in his arms, pushed herself onto her knees. Vincent meanwhile, struggled beneath the monster. The life form had wrapped its two tentacle-like arms around Vincent's wrists, and had used its own weight to keep the gunman pinned and unable to escape. Now that the monster was up close, Vincent could see that it did have a mouth, small and thin, across the middle of its smooth face. This mouth opened up now as the life form leaned in close, hungry. Vincent tried to reach for his gun, but it was too far away, his fingers could not reach it. Giving up, Vincent turned back to the life form, which was now just centimeters from his throat. A shot suddenly fired and the life form jerked back with a cry. Barrett had forsaken safety and fired a round into the life form's side. The diversion did the trick. The tentacles around Vincent's wrist slackened, allowing the gunman to break free. He wriggled upwards, just enough to bring up his book and kick the life form in the chest. The monster fell backwards, and without waiting for it to recover, Vincent pushed himself backwards and rushed for his gun. He scooped up the gun. Luckily it was already loaded, so all he had to do was turn and fire. Unfortunately, in his panic, the shot missed a rare occurrence, and the life form, now recovered from its initial shock, lunged at him again. The gunman jumped back. He tried to reload his weapon, but the bullet got stuck in the barrel and would not come loose. He then looked up as Cat She leaped in front of him. Holding Cloud's lightning materia in his open palm, the cat called upon its power and released 6 bolts of energy at the life form. 2 of these bolts hit the ground, but the remaining 4 struck home. The life form reared back and screamed in agony as its body became a mass of electrified energy. Its tentacles quivered, and its tail thrashed against the floor. Cat She lowered the materia and looked back at Vincent, giving him the thumbs up. While his back was turned, the life form, its body still crackling with electricity, lunged forward and struck the cat with the tip of its long left arm. The blow sent the cat flying through the air, though something strange had happened to his body. The instant the life form's arm touched him, Cat's body froze solid and became completely immobile. Even when Cat hit the ground, he did not move, and so he was completely helpless as he rolled over and over. He rolled dangerously close to the edge of the platform. Red 13, seeing this, leaped across and snatched the cat up off the ground, held him gently in his jaws, and then jumped to safety. Seeing that it had failed to eliminate Cat, the life form screeched and lunged again in the direction of Red 13. It did not get far before it stopped and screeched in agonized pain. Its torso then split open and the tip of a large, flat blade pushed its way out. The life form glanced over its shoulder and glared at Cloud, who was standing right behind it, the Buster sword embedded in its back. As the life form moved, Cloud pushed the blade in further, causing it to stop again. Intending to stop Cloud as it had done Cat, the life form started to swing one of its tentacles. This time it was stopped by Tifa, who rushed in and grabbed hold of the arm before it could reach Cloud. Grasping it firmly, she pulled it away from him, ensuring at all times that the tip could not reach her. Before the life form could react, Yuffie ran up on its other side and grabbed hold of its other arm. Now both arms were immobile and unable to move. Only the tail was still moving. This Sid solved by running up beside Cloud and thrusting the remains of his broken spear through the tail's tip. The spear lodged in the grating and held there. With his blade still stuck in the life form's back, Cloud shouted, "Vincent, use Ultima! Finish him off, quick!" Vincent rose to his feet. The Ultima materia was in the gauntlet around his left wrist. He unhooked it and held it in his palm. The materia was deep green with a black center, with small waves of color passing through it. Ultima was a risky materia, its effects were varied. Right now, however, it was brimming with power. The gunman closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and then hurled it at the life form. The materia clattered onto the floor beneath the life form. It glimmered brightly. At the same time Cloud withdrew his blade and leaped backwards along with the rest of his friends. The life form started to turn. The Ultima Materia grew hot. And then exploded. The life form shrieked as a wave of burning white light erupted around it. The heat radiating from the light was intense, it burned and purified. The life form's body shuddered violently as the light burned its way all the way down to the cells. The life form raised its tentacle arms to shield its face, but the arms were already bubbling and melting, turning into liquid. Its tail followed suit, and the life form dropped to the ground. The light from Ultima continued shining in waves tinged with glittering color. Its light was so bright that Cloud and the others had to shield their eyes, lest they be blinded by its intensity. The heat burned their skin and made it prickle. All the while they could hear the life form's terrible, pain scream. Cloud tried to lower his arms and peer through the light. But he could see nothing, just a wall of white with a wavering shadow trapped inside it, writhing and thrashing in agony. The light grew brighter still, and he had to shield his eyes again. The light continued on for a few moments more, and the life form's scream gradually faded away. Moments later the light too, faded to nothing, and the world returned to its normal dark state. Thunder rumbled overhead. In the heat of the battle, they had totally forgotten about the storm. The rain was still falling heavily, they were soaked. Vincent was the first to lower his arm and approach the center of the platform. The Ultima Materia was lying on the ground. It was dark inside, its inner light had gone. Lying beside the materia was Hojo. Hojo, in his normal, human form. The power of Ultima had caused the Genova cells to recede, leaving only the human body behind. The professor was lying face down on the grating. He was not moving. Vincent stood over him, his expression unreadable. Cloud joined him. He also looked down at the unmoving body lying before him. Hojo's eyes were wide open, locked in an endless stare. Yet Cloud could not feel any sympathy for him. Because of this man, there had been many deaths. So many tragedies. Lucretia and Vincent, Nibelheim, Sephiroth. All of these could have been prevented if people like Hojo did not exist. Cloud bent down and picked the materia up off the floor. It was cool. He muttered silently.
Hojo,
said Vincent.
Rest in peace.
Cloud looked away. He could not wish such things for this man. He turned away from Hojo and walked over to the mainframe. Cat Shi was already there, the stop magic had apparently worn off. The cat was in the middle of deactivating the reactors. As he turned a dial, the reactors all gave a loud whoosh and clouds of steam rose into the air from the open roofs. The green glow faded, and the tops began to close. Midgar was safe. Tifa bent down beside Hojo and closed his eyes.
How said
Yuffie. Barrett looked at her. She shrugged.
For him,
she added. Vincent was still watching Hojo. He was filled with mixed feelings. For years he had longed for this moment and yet, now that it was over, Vincent could not help but feel that somehow it was not quite over. He found it difficult to relax and accept that Hojo was gone. The anger was still there inside of him, it had not gone away. Vincent felt Cloud's eyes on him. He looked up and met the swordsman's gaze. In Cloud's eyes Vincent saw the same troubled anger. Cloud held the same hatred and anger for Sephiroth that Vincent did for Hojo. Looking at him, Vincent had to wonder, would Cloud find some peace once he defeated Sephiroth? Or would he, like Vincent, continue to feel things were in some way unfinished? Vincent pushed those thoughts aside. It was not his business. He sheathed his gun, turned his back on Hojo, and walked away. End of chapter.